the relationship between violent social interactions and the development of culture, as shown in political myths. Culture can be best understood as a construct influenced by social and political contexts, rather than as a concept separate from politics and thus universally applicable over time. Mimetic theory suggests that culture, religion, and the sacred arise as means to control mimetic rivalry, which has the potential to escalate into terrible violence. Culture emerges from disorder, resolving conflicts by singling out a victim, leading to peace and relief, making evident that the scapegoat mechanism involves both negative and positive elements, violent mechanisms of solving disorder, and the transformation of said violence through cultural rituals, mythology, and literature. Mimetic theory has extensively argued that civilizations elevate their victims to the status of deities, rather than creating gods from scratch. Nowadays, there's a widespread debate about how all major global religions, when properly interpreted, advocate for peace and kindness. However, acts of great severity are often attributed to certain political ideas that have distorted religious beliefs, as seen in religious zealots, militants, terrorists, extremists, or fundamentalists. These individuals may have misunderstood their faith, or might be political opportunists who exploit the religious and the mythological for a certain benefit. Nevertheless, it is of note that the foundational elements of religion, such as myths, rituals, and taboos, have deep roots in acts of violence. As Girard argues that violence lies at the core of the sacred, a notion that he terms violence, the narratives and ceremonial practices that establish the origins of a society conceal this violence, suggesting that peace, unity, and societal structure are attained through collective violent actions. This single observation might highlight how humans gain knowledge through reciprocal imitation, shaping desires influenced by cultural and social contexts. Influenced by Jacques Lacan's concept of desire is always a desire of the other, Girard posits that violence arises predominantly from rivalry and competitiveness, rather than from aggressiveness. Thus, in a mimetic fashion, political myths as violent mechanisms themselves play a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion, much like ancient and traditional stories did in promoting unity within tribes or towns. These narratives serve to establish meaningful connections between ancestors and the present generation, as well as between what is divine and what is human. Contemporary political myths, in their diverse manifestation, forge powerful emotional identities that are understood as communal. Believers of such myths hold unique interpretations of the world, history, or society that might be difficult for outsiders to understand, allowing them to create a barrier between themselves and their surroundings and to create order. Do we have timing or something, or should I time myself? Okay, I'm good. Thank you. In this light, political myths can be seen as modern manifestations of the sacred, channeling emotions and shaping collective identities in ways that both unite and divide societies. They serve as powerful tools for managing social tensions and conflicts, much like religious narratives and rituals that have done throughout history. Understanding political myth through a Girardian lens provides valuable insights into the complex dynamics of social cohesion, political identity, and the management of violence in contemporary societies. The widespread dissemination of political myths in the 20th century is often regarded as a significant issue in modern times. They have been utilized as key tools by totalitarian regimes, resulting in immense suffering for humanity. These systems have raised critical inquiries into the rational and moral foundations of Western civilization and democracy. They employ concepts like the notion of a superior race or class, alongside a mythical language and symbolic rituals. Researchers have sought to draw connections between these structures and the legendary buildings of ancient civilizations and early societies throughout the examination of ethnology and anthropology. Throughout history, the perception of mythological thinking has been seen as incompatible with scientific and rational reasoning. As a result, the study of myths has become divided amongst various disciplines with different objectives. In the 17th century, with the rise of mathematical and scientific thinking, supernatural explanations for cosmic events lost their popularity. Conventional explanations of creation, like those found in religious texts, clashed with the emerging rational viewpoint that relied on the observable laws and principles. In different languages, myths are used to describe narratives about gods and heroes, with a hint that these histories may not be entirely accurate or factual. For example, the word mythomane is an individual who consistently tells lies in a methodical manner. As a result, myth is often seen as the opposite of truth, reality, and rationality. The study of political myth is a complex subject that is explored by scholars from various scientific disciplines. However, the understanding of the subject in its entirety can be challenging, especially when viewed through the lens of national identity. From an Girardian point of view, this exploration might possess more analytical tools. While the focus of modern mythological studies tend to be on traditional myths, there is a growing fascination with the contemporary myths. Contemporary and conventional myths might share certain key characteristics. They involve a strong belief system, the goal of restoration of order from chaos, and the depiction of powerful forces as unpredictable allies of human destiny, as well as the portrayal of significant historical events as tests that pave the way for a promising future. While Matic argues that political myths rooted in ancient philosophy encompass essential elements such as a legendary narrative linked to the universal aspects of human existence, the establishment, maintenance, and transformation of societal structure and its ethical unity, political myth plays a crucial role in shaping the values and beliefs about social structure and the political connections. The primary purpose of these works is to examine and evaluate the fundamental principles of the state, political authority, leadership, hierarchy, power, government, order, equality, or inequality, and to critically analyze whether these concepts are justified or subject to scrutiny. Girard's theories encourage a comprehensive examination of cultural artifacts, such as myths and literary texts, unveiling significant connections and the potential for shared unexpected origins. Some individuals may choose to disengage when confronted with the idea that myths are actually reflections of real-life events involving the phenomenon of scapegoating. Girard argues that literature and anthropological texts are closely connected. For instance, he suggests that Julius Caesar effectively explores sacrificial themes, surpassing the impact of numerous ethnological studies. It is worth noting that political myths are narratives that certain social groupings embrace as explanations for political happenings. These are methods of understanding complex social realities that may seem straightforward otherwise, but they are actually supported by deep social and psychological requirements. From a Girardian perspective, by the need to contain violence within. These creations emerge from the collective unconscious, contagion, and possess inherent contradictions. From political myths, ideologies emerge as natural processes, contributing to the formation of specific political ideologies. The political side of mythologization emphasizes the focus on the utilitarian and manipulative purposes of violence. A myth is more than just a story, it is also a concrete experience. The contemporary political myth is known for its dynamic nature, as it lacks boundaries and is filled with various interpretations with diverse ideologies. Although they may seem vague, inconsistent, and unstructured at times, there is a specific mythological or language that allows its creation and perpetuation. The mechanisms of collective imagination primarily revolve around a limited range of patterns. The crisis of legitimacy and the identity are common threads that link historical crises which have given the rise of myths. Thus, political myths do not contain any elements that are unexpected or predictable, really. Contemporary political myths frequently seek to reshape the perception of those who have lost as those who have emerged victorious and vice versa. Then, how can we accurately define myth when there is no clear distinction between the different logics of what might be real? Girard provides a definition of myth as a text that is deeply rooted in a representational system that is organized around a concealed scapegoat. Although primitive religious mythology involves the act of scapegoating real victims, philosophy achieves a similar outcome by rejecting religion. There is a strong connection between logical distortions and mythology. Identifying these distortions is a significant step towards a better understanding of myths. All texts are built upon the foundation of scapegoat representations. Mimetic desire, when left unchecked, can lead into a lack of differentiation and the disruption caused by sacrificial crisis. Human institutions strive to curb the propagation of mimetic rivalry, despite the ironic fact that they are deeply entrenched in it. Several rituals exemplify this paradox by creating chaos in order to reinstate cultural order through the act of scapegoating. How are we doing time-wise? 4 minutes. Okay, perfect. Brené Girard's mimetic theory suggests that myths function as a means to conceal and justify the initial act of violence upon which societies are built. Political myths can be viewed as narratives that hide and continue the imitative competitions and scapegoating processes that form from the basis of social structure. Instead than just providing explanations of the past or predictions for the future, these myths serve the purpose of preserving societal unity by channeling imitative violence towards sacrificial victims or scapegoats. Political myths derive their influence not only from logical reasoning, but from their capacity to harness mimetic desire and offer catharsis. This elucidates why political myths are universally embraced in diverse cultures and political frameworks, as they tap into inherent human inclinations towards imitation and sacrificial violence. Hence, the prevailing notion that myths are untrue or misleading does not undermine the reality that political myths are extensively propagated and embraced globally, irrespective of the geographical location, political structure, or economic process. Emphasizing this effectiveness of using shared storytelling to promote comprehension of political communities, regimes, and authority in non-democratic systems. Therefore, there is a struggle among many political narratives that can be seen as a display of mimetic rivalry, where each tale strives to become the prevailing model for imitation. The methods employed to uphold these narratives, storytelling, pictures, and symbols, serve as a mechanism to cultivate mimetic desire and channel it towards specific objects or ideals. Moreover, political myths are essential in totalitarian regimes since they both strengthen imitative connections and offer opportunities for sacrificial violence. It is essential to constantly update these myths in order to ensure their effectiveness in handling situations when imitation leads to conflict and to prevent the occurrence of uncontrolled acts of violence. Social class, ethnicity, and religion play a significant role in shaping political myths by offering diverse role models for emulation in various groups that can be blamed for societal issues. From a mimetic standpoint, political myths do not aim to explain reality, but rather to conceal the genuine essence of human desire and violence. They achieve this by offering regulated channels for these fundamental instincts. And that's it.
Yeah, I thought that was a very rich paper. I was curious, just listening to you as you went. What specifically would you say about the second half of your title, the crisis of make? What is the crisis?
Yeah, I didn't delve into that. It's in the second part of the paper, but it was such a long paper and such little time. But this crisis of meaning comes from chaos. It's like a chaos and uncontrolled violence, and from this uncontrolled violence, there's a crisis in meaning because there's no differentiation between individuals, between groups, between race, between class, because of the violence. The underlying question, I have more slides actually, right? So what is the role of mythologization? Like what this myth does? And also here's the crisis, the concept of crisis, right? So there's a state of undifferentiation between individuals, and that leads to more violence because there are no clear boundaries. So that's really the crisis meaning. But this was really my underlying question, which is in the second half of the paper. But it's what happens to the scapegoat when myth is present. Does it uphold it or does it accelerate it? The scapegoat mechanism. So that was like the real question. But I had to first come into terms with the sacrificial crisis, right? What happens when there's such violence that you have to take tools from culture and the tools that the scapegoat mechanism offers in order to come into order again. And that's a good answer.
Any other question? On coming? Thanks.
Yes, a twist on that question is whether any myth is not political.
Well, I studied political science, and for me, I could argue that everything's political, right? But I think there are some myths that can go above the political. The political is like it's so shallow in a way. It's everywhere that it's nowhere at the same time. So there are myths that that actually come into terms with other existential things. I think politics is something that political myth is so it happens in our everyday life that we don't get any existential questions out of it. That's my belief until now. I've never explored that notion before. Do you have something else to say?
We can continue this conversation, but
Sure.
tease out. So I make a story.
Okay.
And there's a school of thought in my discipline which says that everything we use for is right is best.
Right. Yeah.
And then there are those who argue against that in war.
Of course.
So how do we draw the boundary if they're just...
I don't think there's no boundary, because there is also this notion that history is always told by the lens of the victor, right? Of those who win. So in a way, from like each point of view, it's false. I don't know. But yeah, it's an interesting conversation. No more questions, comments, suggestions,
Darkness.
complaints. Yep.
Because of James. That's it. Like in the stop. The second association is from James Krapfl, the professor, his son of the Central Europe, the Márquez. In Canada. So you have 20 minutes.
I did have slides, but you may not see them.
Yes. Which? Wait a minute.
Oops. That was the wrong button.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So I'm going to talk about a political myth and about an image that you've probably all seen, which is used in a devious fashion to contribute to the crisis of meaning and the intensification of violence that specifically Europe, but much of the rest of the world faces today. If you paid attention to the recent elections to the European Parliament, you know that several neo-Nazis were elected, particularly in East European countries. And it is a reaction, I will argue, to the political myth that uses this image to sustain itself. I'm also going to talk about two ways of creating community in response to violence. We all know the Girardian mechanism through scapegoating of using violence in a specific way to form community. I'm going to try. All right, someone needs to help me. What button do I need to press to move forward?
Which one? So the one in the right is forward, the one in the left is back.
Okay, so
The one in the center front, it's to point.
okay.
Point.
So the one, okay.
I think that's the way you'll hold it.
All right. So the button that points to the right is actually not the button I should push. Got it. So I'm also going to use, as a counterpoint to that, the phenomenologist Jan Patočka's idea of the solidarity of the shaken, which in 1989 did provide an alternate way of forming community, solidarity of those shaken by an experience of violence. And we can see that both the scapegoating mechanism and the solidarity of the shaken are capable of leading to the genesis of new symbolic systems, one based on violence and the other not. And my point of departure and this is deliberately blank so that you stare at me rather than the screen. My point of departure is a recent book by the philosopher Ivan Krastev and the legal theorist Stephen Holmes called The Light That Failed, where they invoke Girard to argue that the years from 1989 to 2016 were an age of imitation, which then has come to an end. While in some respects I'm going to reinforce their thesis, I'm also going to suggest that it needs to be revised based on my own study of European history since 1989. The story that Krastev and Holmes narrate, similar to the one that is associated with the introductory image, is that in 1989, the wall fell, the Cold War ended, and the principal aim of such revolutions as there were in what was called Eastern Europe was to become indistinguishably Western. They were, they say, revolutions of intellectuals, liberal and therefore imitative, with no ideas of their own. And insofar as East European peoples were concerned, copying of Western models was experienced as liberation. The result was the age of imitation, in which the Western-dominated unipolar order made both political and economic liberalism seem unchallengeable. The financial crisis of 2008 then sparked an anti-liberal backlash characterized by the politics of imitation. According to Krastev and Holmes, Hungarians were the first to rebel against the replacement of communist orthodoxy with liberal orthodoxy, but the anti-liberal counter-revolution, as they call it, which began in Hungary, has now spread worldwide. There is much to recommend in this interpretation. Following Girard, Krastev and Holmes point out that imitation of desires and goals has a tendency to become conflictual. Krastev and Holmes accurately describe sentiments that I have often heard in formerly communist EU member states of a dictatorship of Brussels at worst, or at best an unequal relationship where the East is supposed to learn from the West, but the reverse does not apply. But I must disagree with Krastev and Holmes when it comes to their characterization of what happened in 1989. And here I think they are actually part of the problem they're trying to diagnose. Reassessment of what actually happened in 1989 necessarily changes our understanding of what has happened since, with implications of where we might go. And whereas Krastev and Holmes offer no hope, we're simply due to a spiraling of violence, I think a more careful reading of the past 35 years suggests where we can find it.
Okay.
Never mind. My first book was about the revolution of 1989, and I focused, forget about the slides, we don't have time to deal with it, was about the revolutions of 1989, where I focused on Czechoslovakia, which provides the best examples of the potential of the revolution of 1989. In that 3/4 of the population actively participated, they left documents, and unlike East Germany, which started out in a very similar fashion, it was not swallowed up by a neighboring country. So Czechoslovakia was best able to follow its own course. When I conducted the bulk of my research in the early noughts, traveling across the Czech and Slovak republics, more than one person related the impression that the revolution had been a swindle. So how does that make sense? The tens of thousands of documents I collected provided an answer, And it's symptomatic of the problem that although most of these documents written by citizens themselves were always publicly available for research, no one showed any interest in them before I studied them. So what made it possible for so many people to express publicly their hopes for the future? The miracle of 1989, as people experienced it, was not that communist regimes came to an end. It was the rebirth of community, the discovery of a common language, which then made possible a new social contract, at least in some places. Let's stop the slides. I'm not going to mess with them. It takes too much time. But it was not the same process everywhere. In East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, at least for some time, power was in the streets, and citizens forced the pace of change, giving them an experience of authorship which would have lasting consequences. As we'll see in other countries of Eastern Europe, this did not happen. In the revolutionary countries, this collective effervescence, to use Durkheim's term, was a result of the solidarity of the shaken. In East Germany, 70,000 people on October 9th marched around the Ring in Leipzig in reaction to violence that had previously occurred in Dresden and in opposition to the threat of violence that loomed over the cities after the weekly prayers for peace in the chief Church of St. Nicholas. And violence was averted at the very last minute in what seemed like a miracle. In Prague, on November 17th, there was real violence when police intervened against students peacefully protesting for freedom and in commemoration of Nazi violence exactly 50 years previously. But then the public reaction to this violence against the nonviolent students led to a nonviolent civic movement, very similar to what had started in East Germany. In Romania as well, the public movement started as a reaction against violence by the regime, in this case against a church pastor. This collective effervescence of the solidarity of those shaken by violence then led to a series of, maybe you can see them, though you can't, led to a series of months of collective effervescence in the street, with people articulating ideals for the future, transforming symbols, generating a new symbolic vocabulary. And in my book, I describe in detail what some of these ideals were, but they included, among other things, a rather radical form of democracy, much more radical than what later appeared, mixing direct with indirect forms of democracy, imagining democracy as something that would be economic as well as political, about which more in a moment. And these ideals were articulated primarily with regard to people's own past, or to a common European heritage going back to 1789, rather than to the contemporary West. Many of these ideals have, in part, characterized societies since 1989, but others have been forgotten. And why they've been forgotten or ignored is a question that I now want to confront. Like the revolution of 1789, that of 1989 inspired a counter-revolution. A diffuse movement of domestic and international actors opposed to at least some of the revolution's aims. It was a refined counter-revolution, fighting not with Leviathan's sword, but with his crozier, using rhetoric and myth to reshape belief. An early example was Helmut Kohl's adoption in December 1989 of Egon Krenz's term Wende, which simply means change, as an alternative to the more radical-sounding word revolution, which was spontaneously welling up from East Germany's churches and squares. Kohl's interest in using the word Wende instead of revolution was the same as Krenz's. Revolution is too radical. In Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel also questioned whether the term revolution was really applicable in December 1989, and a month later, leaders of the civic movements in Prague and Bratislava actually told citizens to cut it out, to stop their efforts at democratizing their workplaces and enacting their ideals at local levels. Sociological surveys conducted at the end of 1989 in Czechoslovakia showed that a majority of citizens, over 90%, wanted to preserve socialism or perhaps merge socialism with market models along lines that had been tried in 1968, but interrupted when the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia. Now they thought we're free to do it. And part of this was you taking advantage of new laws where workers could fire their directors and elect new ones, implementing workplace democracy. But the leaders of the civic movement told them to stop and wait until newly elected parliaments would pass laws that would solve this problem instead of it being solved from below. And this led to the persistence of the communist nomenclatura in workplaces, and that, coupled with the Communist Party's insistence that it alone could save socialism, stimulated the erosion of attachment to socialism over the course of 1990. And in the fall, when Václav Klaus proposed his privatization program, it was presented as a way to remove corrupt people from workplaces and from business. Later, when it proved that corrupt people were more likely to succeed in business, it led to a change in rhetoric again. This time, there is no such thing as dirty money. All of this in light of a new interpretation of what had happened in 1989, saying that economic democracy means competition among firms rather than democracy within them, and leading to a new myth that would become dominant ever since, that what happened in 1989 was merely a political change, and that democracy, a liberal democracy, goes hand in hand with a market economy along Western lines. Now, in those countries that did experience revolution in 1989, this led to populist reactions. But in those countries that did not experience revolution, especially Hungary and Poland, it led to a phenomenon that I would call revolution envy. In Poland and Hungary, there were roundtables. Power never left the hands of old or new elites. Citizens applauded, but they did not force the pace of change. And so throughout the 1990s, first the left, which came back to power briefly in 1993, but then adopted the Western program, and then the right, which became steadily more radical in the late 90s and early noughts, promised to deliver the revolution that Poles and Hungarians should have had, but did not. And this led in 2010 to Viktor Orban's so-called electoral revolution, followed by his constitutional revolution in 2012, and the victory of law and justice in Poland in 2015, likewise promising to correct the mistakes of 1989, when the liberal elite had cooperated with the West against the will of ordinary citizens. So, into this picture, I mean, it's worth pointing out that Orban's idea is not exactly the idea of 1989 either. In what has resulted in Hungary is an authoritarian state where the citizens themselves are not involved in democracy. It is a party that is supposed to represent them. So, and this, of course, is now tied with the revolution that broke out in Ukraine in 2013 and 14, which also started through the solidarity of the shaken. The Euromaidan in 2013 did not actually mobilize a majority of the population, but when the police attacked the students who wanted Ukraine to be close to the European Union, using violence against innocent children, as many people saw it, this mobilized a majority of the population against the regime, similar to what happened in 1989, saying we do not want to live in a society that is ruled by violence. And that led to the Revolution of Dignity. And it's noteworthy that this idea of the Revolution of Dignity we saw earlier in 2011 in the Arab Spring. Belarusians would use the same idea in their attempt at revolution in 2020. And as I argued in my book, the central idea of 1989 was actually humanity, a society that should be for human beings rather than for systems. And this led to a second counter-revolution, Vladimir Putin's counter-revolution. First in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, and now more recently with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Putin seeking first to undo the results of the Revolution of Dignity, since for him the worst consequence would be a model right on his doorstep, with a model in a culture in a country with a language very similar to his own, which could destabilize his dictatorship at home. More broadly, Putin, of course, wants a counter-revolution that would undo many of the results of 1989 and restore Russian power to the greatest extent possible. And so now the populist movement in Europe is merging with Putin's counter-revolution in a way that threatens to undo, indeed, many of the results of the revolution of 1989 in what seems to be a greater and greater willingness to use violence to achieve aims, which, as we know, leads to escalation and mimetic doubles and nowhere we want to end up. And there's going to be a presentation later at this conference on which I'm very interested in, on how the nuclear card plays into this escalating rhetoric of violence and escalating violence on the ground. So where is the hope that I said I would leave you with? It lies again in the solidarity of the shaken and the possibility of resurrecting the ideals of 1989 that arose from this solidarity of the shaken, and whether we can indeed build a society for human beings rather than for impersonal systems. And with that, I will close and invite discussion. And I apologize that I am technically incompetent.
Thank you. Let's do.
So, it's really interesting to see how this is happening in Europe, yes, specifically in Eastern Europe. But to me, the question, what would be the consequences if this continues to happen? Would we have signs for contagions from other?
I think Krastev and Holmes certainly argue that we're seeing contagion, and I think we can definitely, I can supplement their arguments with further evidence. Has been this right-wing populist wave, as you know, going from Brazil to the United States. Other countries are part of this as well, but these are very prominent non-European examples. It's interesting that Viktor Orban has been a guest of honor on Fox News in the United States, and I'm sure he's popular in Brazil in certain quarters as well. I'm from the United States originally, even though I live in Canada. I do my research in what used to be called Eastern Europe, and I hear exactly the same political myths in both places. Some minor changes, but there's definitely contagion happening here in terms of rhetoric, which then will have contagion in terms of results as well, of actions that are motivated by the myths that allow us to interpret the world.
To me, it's interesting though, because we have the right wing being so popular in the Western part of the world, in Latin America, we have like this left-wing tendency. So I don't know, to me that's quite interesting. If populism is really a source of temptation.
That's a good question. I'm not sure it's populism itself. It depends, of course, how we define populism in part. The initial reaction that I pointed to in the early 1990s was motivated by a genuine sense that decisions have been made without us, about us, without us. That the revolution was made to create a kind of democracy in which all of us could participate meaningfully. And this was part of the social contract that we have all agreed on, and now decisions have been made that we did not sanction. They were made behind closed doors. We had nothing to do with them. And they were not actually what the public had wanted. So the initial populism was certainly very democratic, and I would say just. But then it began to be used for more partisan purposes. And here's where we see a distinction, that the initial revolutionary movement was all-encompassing. The vast majority of citizens, and even many communists, came behind this new program of a society for human beings, with all the ideals that came with that. But the new political entrepreneurs who mobilized the frustration that resulted saw society in a more restrictive way, that their political programs were for the good members of society against the bad ones, and this leads to scapegoating, leading to the downward spiral away from the really miraculous place where we started. The big question is whether this miraculous period of genuine harmony and the ability to build from that can last long enough to establish anything like the millennium, let alone, even a few years, let alone the millennium, or whether we're just going to kill ourselves. History does not exactly repeat itself, but it rhymes. I don't know who said that, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And part of the reason it rhymes is due to the nature of myth and the way we make sense of the world, in that language itself restricts us to certain ways of speaking. And I could refer to narrative theory and the various implotments like tragedy and comedy. And there are only a certain number of plots. The details may change, but the plot structures tend to go through cycles, starting with myth and romance, and then degenerating into tragedy, and finally irony, where meaning is contested, and when people question whether there is any meaning, and then through an experience of sacrifice or the solidarity of the shaken, you can start again with something like myth that allows you to rebuild, to create a new symbolic system. So this cycle does repeat itself endlessly through history, but I do think that we can see a linear progression, and this is Girard's argument with the revelation of the scapegoating mechanism, that it no longer works as effectively as it did before the revelation. And I think this is tied with the role of violence in revolution. It's interesting that if you study the rhetoric of revolution going back to the 17th century, all revolutionaries think that they have had a miraculously nonviolent revolution. Even in France in 1789, after the taking of the Bastille, people were ecstatic. This was a nonviolent revolution. So that's a constant, but we do see a real lessening of violence over time in the initial phase, and then later on things can change. So there is a greater awareness or consciousness of the role of violence in signification, which gives us an opportunity to avoid following the path toward the spiral of violence and staying with a kind of society built on the solidarity of the shaken. But we're so slow collectively in learning these lessons that I'm not sure we'll learn them in time to save ourselves.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, James. Our last speaker is Carlos Mora, that is in Bogotá. He studied philosophy, a master in philosophy, and is a businessman. Okay. My paper is titulated "Of the Penal Crisis, the Clamor for Punishment and Lynching." Since the 1990s in the United States, Europe, and Latin America, the last one, more delayed than the other two, public policies has been seeking to create social conditions to generate less violent space for their citizens. From different political and social sectors, punitive rhetoric has been used as political strategy. In this way, an increase in the severity of the sentence is advocated, restrictions of the rights of inmates, a non-restorative sentence, among others, to the point of sacralizing, aka the iron fist, regardless of the consequence. That's why we wonder about this topic based on mimetic theories, from the welfare state to the penal state. The zero-tolerance theory is a contemporary approach to citizen security based on the proposal of the book Fixing Broken Windows by George L. Kellin and Catherine M. Coates, which propose severely punishing any crime, regardless of its seriousness. Its main objective is to reduce the time that passes between the crime and the judicial response. Therefore, the punishment will precede the offender to commit a greater crime. In 1994, this security approach was put in practice in New York, led by the Major Rudolph Giuliani and the police chief William Barton. These instructions given to the police were that they should be stricter in the application of the law with respect to small infractions. The police began to carry out intensive patrols, removing from the street any person or situation that may infer some type of situational risk for citizens. Controls are intensified, police force increased, better tools are created within the reach of citizens, such as the 911 police telephone line. Costs are inflated, but results are beginning to be achieved. Crime rates go down and society feels safer. From a statistical perspective, these police succeed, becoming a model for different countries. For example, in Argentina, in the 20s, in 2000, William Barton go to give some lectures to the police to give this achievement. The purpose of these policies was to recover public space, which meant taking it away from the criminal, whether real or imaginary. However, this increased human rights violations and police brutality. By this, people who, from the officer's perspective, represent incivility or disorder were detained and imprisoned. The majority of those arrested were Black and Latino. This shows a logic of stigmatization and social labeling, where there are first-class citizens who meet westernized physical and cultural standards, and second- and third-class citizens who resemble us but differ in social, cultural, and moral terms.
due to their behaviors considered uncivilized or savage, generating a deformation of the other that always appears to me as different. In his analysis of this phenomenon, Lloyd Wacant notes that in the United States, as the punitive police increased, the welfare state was simultaneously dismissed. Punitive discourse gained strength as political tool with the discourse of the right and the left. For the French sociologists, Latin America and Western Europe got into this perspective more or less like a servile way, imitating the penal expansion, but not as a trend or modernization of the technique, but as a submission to a transnational politic project, which has as its case the recruitment of public authority necessary to promote the advance of neoliberalism. There is a correlation between penal and social aid policies, as Wacant argues. These correlations can be attributed to the liberal paternalistic state, as both policies are guided by the misconception of social responsibility of the client. Consequently, the subject is treated in opposition to the universal rights and duties of the citizens, generating a hyper-individualization and atomization of social responsibility. From the perspective of neoliberalism, there is a reduction in social expense accompanied by an increase in security expenses, reinforcing the social and moral order. This operation is based on the idea of having a minimum state, in which it gives free rein to the creative force of the market, which causes the most disadvantaged to be dominated by the whims of competition. Only a few will emerge victorious. Those who can't will be categorized as misfits, lazy, undesirable, or human waste. They don't fit in the prevailing socioeconomic model, the so-called underclass. This population represents a constant threat to the harmony balance of social relationships. Citizens who fully enjoy their rights yearn for a state that guarantees daily security. The welfare state expands its resources in the penal sphere to safeguard itself while deregulating the social sphere, resulting in a mutually reinforcing causal and functional association. This allows the welfare state to divest itself of economic responsibilities in social affairs while tolerating a high level of poverty and inequality because it has an institution that protects it from any danger. The deployment of the penal state doesn't happen only because it's repressive power. It also opens the doors for a broader redefinition of social responsibility where total control is over the economic interest, welfare, and penal aspect of its citizens, all justified under the slogan of fighting against crime. This is translated from the perspective of Wacant as the deployment of the policy of criminalization of poverty, which moves in two directions. The first one consists of the organization of social service as instruments of surveillance to control the subject less adapted in economic and moral order. The second consists of the massive and systematic use of imprisonment. The first one watches the subject behavior according to their norm and their prohibitions, and if he doesn't do so, the second device punishing him, sending an exemplary message, not to those who are punished, but to the working citizens who are told not to leave their social positions without exposing themselves to symbolic and material degradation worse than the most humiliating task. And it reminds us that the only counts on oneself in this war of all against all. However, we will make a variation on this perspective and point out that it is the war of all against one. The failure of the punishment apparatus and lynching. The most recent United Nations report on the global prison population reveals that 1.7% of the global population is deprived of livers, equivalent to 11.2 million people. This figure is 3.6 lower than in the year 2019. Despite it being a favorable measure, the report fails to provide specific data regarding the number of individuals who were released, killed by COVID-19, or who were not persecuted during the pandemic. Furthermore, the report indicates that the number of individuals incarcerated will only increase. An example of this is the incarceration rate in the United States, which during the pandemic resulted in 1.7 million fewer individuals being imprisoned, but after it increased by 1.8 million. In Latin America, Australia, and New Zealand, the number of prisoners increased by 10%, which makes the total number of prisoners of 70%. Finally, the report indicates that the prison systems are operating at more than 100% of their planned capacity, with many prisons reaching 150% or more occupancy. In addition, there is a wave of distrust in judicial systems. In Colombia, Mexico, and the United States, to name a few. In Colombia, the level of reliability of the judicial system is of 10%, although its impunity rate is 93.3%. Mexico impunity has resulted in cases not being reported. According to the organization Impunidad Cero, 94% of cases are not reported, and of the crimes committed, only 1% are resolved. i.e., out of 100 cases, only 14 are resolved. In the United States, the impunity rate is 20%, and the judicial system is destroyed by 42% of people, but this number is rising. An analysis of this phenomenon within the framework of the mimetic theory reveals that the judicial and penal systems can be comprehended as an actualization of the sacrificial ritual system, whose myth is the pretense of justice and security. This theory allows us to see that the primary function of the judicial system is to contain mimetic violence, being the only instrument that has a monopoly on vengeance and can impart it equitably in society through the penal system, without repercussions. Similarly, the penal system, which neither eradicates crime nor rehabilitates the convicted, serves the system as means of purging criminals from society. In the same way, the unanimous accusation required in archaic societies is left in the hands of a few who represent the whole society. The courts make the accusation and punish or release any individual. However, because of the unfavorability and impunity rates of some judicial system, it appears that the myth is failing, and therefore its rights and prohibitions do not work. The judicial system is now unable to contain mimetic theory, causing it to be exerted on an environment, on an innocent victim to whom the evil afflicting society is attributed. As we already know, society seeks something to rid itself of evil, and it must be eliminated through the mechanism of the scapegoat. The scapegoat is a substitute victim, an innocent person who takes the place of the real antagonism. The scapegoat, or the victim, is not substitute for some particularly endangered individual, nor is offered up to some individual of particularly bloodthirsty temperament. Rather, it is a substitute for all members of the community, offered up by the members themselves. The sacrifice serves to protect the entire community from its own violence. It prompts the entire community to choose victims outside itself. The elements of this session scattered throughout the community are down to the person of the sacrificial victim and eliminated, at least temporarily, but it's sacrificed. To protect the community, sacrifice refers to its social function, that is, it seeks to eliminate violence which originates in the community itself, and tries to replenish the strange social unity. The process of zero tolerance and criminalization of poverty have contributed to the expulsion of the other from our borders, to the deformation of the other. and thus to being able to point the finger of blame. As Garcia Borges points out, thanks to generality of concepts such as crime and delinquency, the imaginaries of this unique victim are configured. A representative case of this phenomenon is the ñero, chaca, the hobo, or the street gangster, the representation of the underclass. The mythical shapes of the conception of the delinquent are a potential one deform the subject and show typical characteristics of this specific population, which allows society to exert violence on him. As already mentioned, the judicial system does not perform its ritual function. Society opts to expiate the evil by recurring to the lynching of the common thief. This violence did not perform its cathartic function either, which leads the community to a spiral of meaningless violence which the Clamor to be extinguished or drowned by a ritual that works and does not lead to them to its extinction. As a result of this, speech such as those used by Nayib Bukele and Javier Milei take force, where the enemy must be eliminated without contemplation, taking innocent victims with them to satisfy this lack. We can only hope that the accusing finger will never point us or any of our relatives. Positive mimesis as liberation. As we know, mimesis can lead us to endless conflict and rivalry. But it can also lead us to a committed to radical responsibility for the other. It has also led us with tools for thinking about positive mimesis as a way of the violent spiral. As Gerard points out, quoting Leonardo Bosch, I still think that the other pole of mimetic desire should be more emphasized. I'm referring to desire that brings goodness into history. On the one hand, there is a mimetic mechanism that produces victims and creates a historical culture grounded on victims. On the other hand, and at the same time, there is an inclusive desire which looks for a solidary mimetism, committed to making historical possible the production of goods. I continue the text taking an example of those or some organizations like Acción Interna, Liberal Teatral, and Teatro Penitenciario. They work with people deprived of liberty about theater. The theater facilitates the process of conversation in the inmates because in friends confront them with their violence, their desires, the lack situations, putting in the foots of other person that it's his character. I think that it is good, but we have to go more. We have to make another step, and the civil society have to involucrate in this process. If we make this, I'm going to read the conclusion. The imagining of art expressed in theater offers an opportunity to break the cycle of violence in this environment, at least from the perspective of individuals deprived of liberty. Despite this, and following our proposal that mimetic theory places us in a space of radical responsibility towards the other and their care, this initiative should be expanded towards civil society. This implies opening a space where both deprived individuals deprived of liberty and their victims can coexist in the play, assuming the role of the other and understanding each other in the theatrical experience. The process of understanding, facilitated by the adaptation of the characters, paves the way for a double reconciliation process, first among human beings and then with the sacred, by recognizing that the other is equal to me and not my rival. The paradigm is changed and a new model is proposed that fosters mutual care and community reconciliation.